Welcome back to the MMA Training Bible's Guide to Developing Unstoppable Endurance in 6 months. I'm Dr. Jason Gillis. We've covered a lot in this course, and we've really broken it down into two parts. The first half, sessions 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, it was all about understanding the science of mixed martial arts. In the second half, sessions 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, it's all about applying what we've learned. In session 6, you learned the method. In session 7, I taught you how to schedule training phases, the big ones across the fight plan. In session 8, I taught you how to forecast training volume and intensity across your fight plan. And what we want to do in this session, session 9, it's plan the training sub-phases and the training weeks. So we're drilling down deeper and deeper and deeper in our organization of our fight plan. The learning objectives. Before we jump into that interactive process where we work together to create that fight plan, you're following along in that step-by-step guide, I've got to review a couple concepts that are really going to help you create the best program for you. The first one, it's training difficulty. The next one is load planning. And then the final concept I want to introduce you to, it's training sub-phases. And then we're going to jump into that step-by-step process where we'll work together to create that individualized and periodized plan that's going to enhance your endurance. So this is the outline to this video lecture. First, we're going to recap the fight plan. Then I'm going to introduce you to those three concepts, concepts 1, 2, and 3. And then we're going to jump into that step-by-step process where we work together to create that plan. But let's start by just recapping what we've got so far, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Okay, so you should have your training volume and intensity scheduled across all your different phases like you see here, your transition, your taper, your fight camp, the fight-specific prep phase, and the general prep phase. So let's switch back over to the PowerPoint, and let's start to talk about some of those key concepts that are really going to help you when you're designing your training plan. So the first concept that I want to introduce you to, it's that of training difficulty. And let's just work our way through this little diagram here. So what we're seeing on the horizontal axis here, this is training weeks. So let's say you've got 4 training weeks planned. And normally when you lump a couple training weeks together, that's referred to as a sub-phase. Or at least the MMA Training Bible refers to it as a sub-phase. And sub-phases can last to a couple weeks, to more than a couple weeks. But we'll talk more about that next. So in any case, we're looking at training weeks here. So we have week 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we lump those all together in one phase, sub-phase. And what we're looking at on the vertical scale, it's training difficulty. So it's the training difficulty that exists in each of these training weeks. And training difficulty, it can range from no training at all to very low level of training difficulty to low, medium, high, and then a very high level of training difficulty. So the thing that I want to mention here is the concept of training difficulty. It's a little bit of a difficult concept to grasp because there's a lot of things that influence training difficulty. If you think about it, it could be the number of intervals that you perform in a given session. It could be the intensity that you're working with in that session. It could be the number of practice sessions that you have in the run of a day. Maybe you have a morning session and maybe you have an afternoon session. It could be the number of sessions that you have in the run of a week. So all of these things can influence your training difficulty, and you do manipulate all of these things to influence your training difficulty. So what you can see here is training week number 1. It has a training difficulty of low, and then the training difficulty increases in week 2 a little bit, and then it increases in week 3, and then it drops down in week 4. And this is a characteristic sort of sub-phase or development over 4 weeks or so. And so how you apply this concept is maybe in week 1 you have 1 session a day, if that's your level. And maybe in week 2 you have a session every day, but on one day you have 2 sessions. And then maybe in training week 3 you have 2 2-a-days, and then the rest are just 1-a-days. And then you go back down in week 4, and then you have maybe rather than all those sessions, you have maybe a couple days where you don't have any sessions because this is maybe considered a recovery week. So this concept of training difficulty, it really guides how we plan on a weekly and monthly basis, and it's the first important concept that you need to grasp. The next concept that I want to introduce you to, it's that of load planning. Now, load planning, you could really break it down into, it's the ratio of work weeks where you're training hard versus that of recovery weeks. So when we look at load plans, we're talking about how many work weeks there are versus recovery weeks in each subphase. So you can have a load plan of 1-to-1, and that could be a whole subphase. And so in this case, the first training week, it's going to be a work week, or you're going to be working hard. And then the second week, it's a recovery week. Now, you may ask yourself, well, why do we have recovery weeks? Well, notice that in every case, in every subphase, we're always going to have a recovery week at the end of the subphase. Whether it's 2 progressive work weeks where you have hard training here and even harder training in the second week, followed by a recovery week in this 2-to-1 load plan, or in the 3-to-1 load plan where you have progressively increasing training difficulties from week 1, 2, and 3, and then the 4th week is a recovery week. You always have the recovery week. The reason why you have that recovery week is because it assumes that you're building up fatigue during this first week, and you need to restore yourself. You need to recover. Now, this is one of the most important concepts in periodization, and this is one of the things that most people don't do. They don't build in recovery weeks because there's such a pressure to train hard all the time, and there's a perception on behalf of your coaches and your training partners that if you're not training, you're not going to be adapting. But in all honesty, this period of recovery, this is when probably most of your adaptations will start to present. So you need to have this recovery week. If there's one lesson you learn from this whole series, it's that you need to build in recovery weeks. So this is the concept of load planning. It fits into various subphases, and basically, this is what you're going to be programming in right across your fight plan. And I'm going to show you how to do it. Sometimes we're going to be using subphases with a 3-to-1 loading plan. Sometimes we're going to be using subphases with a 2-to-1 loading plan. And sometimes we're going to be using subphases with a 1-to-1 loading plan. So now I hope you understand the concept of load planning. It may seem a little bit fuzzy, and training difficulty. That concept may also seem a little fuzzy. But we're going to apply this stuff coming up in the next couple slides, and hopefully by the end of this series, this lecture, everything will be very, very clear, and you'll have that concept down. The next concept that I want to introduce you to, and the last concept, concept 3, it's that of subphases. There are different types of subphases. So we already mentioned that you should always segment your training into subphases. Well, there are actually a couple of different types of subphases that you should be segmenting your training into. One is called the developmental subphase. Another one is called a shock subphase. Another one is called a taper subphase. And then the final one I want to introduce you to is called a transition subphase. And I'm sure you can kind of guess where some of these go. You know that the taper subphases are going to go in the taper period. You know that the transition subphases are going to go in the transition period. But where we implement the developmental subphases and the shock subphases, well, that's a little bit more of the art. So we're going to show you a little bit more details on each of these subphases in the next couple slides. The first subphase that I want to elaborate on is called the developmental subphase. So here's an example of a 3-to-1 loading plan in a developmental subphase. So we can see training difficulty over on the vertical axis, which ranges from no training to very low, low, medium, high, and very high. And we see that this covers about 4 weeks or so. So in the developmental subphase, it's characterized by this progressively increasing loading pattern, this progressive increase in training difficulty across a series of weeks, and then you have your recovery week. So the purpose is to progressively increase your training difficulty over a period of 3 weeks. And that's it. You don't want to see sharp changes in training difficulty. And again, how you're manipulating training difficulty, it could be any number of things. It could be the intensity that you're working with. It could be the number of training sessions you have, various things, but we'll talk more about that when we're actually programming the training sessions. So that's a developmental subphase characterized by this progressive increase in training difficulty, followed by that all-important recovery week. The next type of subphase that I want to talk about in a little more detail is the shock subphase. So again, we're looking at training difficulty on this vertical axis, and then we're looking at training weeks across the horizontal axis. And this is the subphase with, you can see here, a 3-to-1 loading plan where we have 3 work weeks followed by 1 recovery week. Now, what you're going to notice here is we have this progressive increase in training difficulty from weeks 1 to 2, which looks a lot like a developmental subphase. But then when we get to weeks 3, we see this very large increase in training difficulty. So let's say maybe you have 3 training sessions a week here. In training week 3, maybe you're doubling that. Maybe you're going up to 6. So there's going to be a whole lot of stress during this week 3. And as a result of that increased stress, there's probably going to be a greater physiological adaptation. But one thing that I want to mention, whenever you see this large increase in training difficulty, you need to make sure that you have a lot of room built in for recovery. So in this recovery week, after you have this large increase in training difficulty, you need to make sure that you have even more recovery than you normally would have. So you really need to do even less during that week in order to dissipate the fatigue that built up during this 3rd week, this shock subphase. And shock subphases, they only should be incorporated every once in a while. But don't worry, I'm going to show you exactly when you should be thinking about incorporating shock subphases. But they're absolutely critical in dictating your adaptation to training. The next subphase that I want to talk about in a little bit more detail is the taper subphase. So let me just orient you to what we're looking at here. Again, we're looking at training difficulty on this vertical axis, and then we have training weeks across the horizontal. And what we're looking at here, this is a developmental subphase, which is the last subphase of the fight camp. And you see this is developmental because it progressively increases in training difficulty across 4 weeks. And what you notice is that during the taper subphase, which at most should last 2 weeks or so, you're seeing large reductions in training difficulty. In that first week, in the 5th week here, for example, you're seeing a very large reduction in training difficulty, and then you're seeing an even further reduction in training difficulty. And this is very, very important. We'll talk a little bit more about why we do this later on, but just as a little tip, the whole point is to maintain training intensity and drastically cut training volume before your fight in order to bring about the adaptations, in order to dissipate fatigue. And when you do that appropriately, then you should bring about a peak in your performance. And there's nothing magical about the peak again. It's just about dissipating all that fatigue that was built up from previous training. So this is what a typical taper subphase would look like, and we're going to work together to schedule those for you shortly. Let's talk in a little more detail about the transition subphase. So again, we're looking at training difficulty on the vertical axis, and we're looking at training weeks in the horizontal axis. And for frame of reference, we're looking at the taper here. And remember, the taper features very large reductions in training difficulty over about 2 weeks or so at most. And then you have your fight. And then the transition subphase, it's always scheduled after your fight. And the length of the transition subphase, it really depends upon primarily how many injuries you have and the severity of those injuries. So if you've broken a bone, the transition subphase is going to be much longer than a couple weeks. But if you have a fight coming up in a very short period of time, then the transition, maybe it's going to be a little bit shorter. But in general, it's maybe a couple weeks or so. So here's an example of a 4-week transition. And the whole point of it is to start off with a very, very low level of training difficulty. And there's a couple different types of activities you should do and a couple types of activities you should avoid. Mainly sport-specific activities you want to avoid, and you want to do those things that you used to do before maybe you started training so seriously in MMA, like maybe you like rock climbing. So you do all these sort of fun things, but you're still being physically active. But we can talk more about that later on. Now, again, this may look like a developmental training subphase, but there's a key difference. In general, the training difficulties are much lower in the transition subphase. And the differences between weeks, it's going to be much smaller. So you're going to see much smaller increases in training difficulty across the transition subphase. And after the transition subphase, you're transitioning into your new fight camp. So those are the 3 concepts that I wanted to introduce you to. What I want to do now is I want to get into that process of actually planning all of these things, the subphases and the training weeks. First, we're going to plan the transition, then we're going to plan the taper, followed by the fight camp, followed by the general preparation phase, and then last we're going to do the fight-specific preparation phase. So let's bring up that fight plan and let's get into it. Okay. So the first thing that you should do is you should number all of your subphases like I've done here. You just number them right from left to right. So we got 1, 2, and I'll scroll across 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We've got 8 different subphases. And so that's the first thing you should do. The next thing you should do is you should number your training weeks. And I've done that here. You can see we've got training week number 1, 2, 3, 4. And right across all the way over here, ultimately we have 31 training weeks until we fight. So now let's go and describe how we actually categorize these subphases. So let's start with what we know. The transition subphase, we don't need to have any special names for that. It's just the transition subphase, and it's made of just normal weeks. So all you need to do is just keep the number there. It's no problem. And then we have the taper subphase. And the taper subphase is always going to be composed of what are called peaking weeks. And remember, the whole point of reducing the volume here is to encourage a peak in your performance. So that's easy, taper and then peak and peak. The next thing we want to do is we want to slot in the fight camp. And the first thing that I'll recommend you slot in, it's the first 4 weeks of the fight camp. It's a shock subphase. And the shock subphase is going to be composed of 3 shock training weeks followed by a recovery week. Now, I call it a shock, and other people call it a shock subphase, is because it's designed to shock your physiology. It's designed to shock your psychology. It's designed to shock your body into bringing about a larger adaptation. Remember, that's why we see the increase in training volume here. But it's going to be hard in other ways as well. And then the last 4 weeks of the fight camp, we're going to call this a developmental subphase, and it's going to be composed of developmental training weeks that progressively increase in difficulty, and then we have a reduced difficulty in this the fourth week. Now, normally in every subphase it features 3 training weeks and then a recovery week. But because we have the taper right here, I've decided to make this developmental subphase have 4 developmental training weeks, because if we, I fear, had a recovery week right here, it might be too much recovery and I don't want you to be overtraining. So I'm going to keep this a developmental subphase with 4 developmental training weeks. So we've scheduled the subphases and training weeks for the fight camp. Now we want to go back and start from the very beginning and schedule the subphases and the training weeks for the general preparation phase. And I'm going to recommend, and it's up to you to change this, but I'm going to recommend you start with a developmental subphase, which is going to be composed of 3 developmental training weeks where the training difficulty progressively increases in each of these weeks, and then we have a recovery week. And then I'm going to recommend another developmental subphase where again we focus on ever increasing developmental training difficulty followed by a recovery week. And then by the time we get over here to the fight specific preparation, I'll recommend that you try to get a shock subphase in there. And this is going to be including a developmental training week followed by 2 shock training weeks where you increase the difficulty of training, and then a recovery week. And then as you move farther into the fight-specific prep, put a developmental subphase in there, because as soon as we get into fight camp, you're going to be having a shock subphase. And this is going to be composed of developmental training weeks followed by recovery. Generally, what you want to do is every once in a while, you're incorporating a shock subphase. So when we're trying to forecast the difficulty of training, I got a tip for you. Start low. Start with a low level of training difficulty and progress according to how you've laid out your subphases and your training weeks. So let me give you an example of how this works, and you can follow along with me. I've gone ahead and I've filled out the weekly training difficulty. So what you're looking at here is we're looking at the difficulty of training, and this is by the week. And all I've done is I've just drawn this black line to indicate where I want the difficulty to be. And hopefully now you can see what I mean by developmental training weeks, developmental subphases, and shock subphases. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through all of this so you have a good idea of why I've done this. So you're going to start over here on the left, and I recommend you start with a low training difficulty. And this is basically what you're going to be doing next week. So let's make it low, and that's your first week. And then the next developmental training week, you increase the difficulty maybe to around low medium. And then by the third developmental training week, you're approaching high. And then you got to have a recovery week. This is of critical importance, because if you're not taking recovery weeks, then I think you're going to increase your chances of overtraining. And periodization, building in these recovery weeks, is one of the best things that you can do to avoid overtraining. So this is the general structure of a developmental subphase: building, 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 recovery. And so we're going to have that same format again in the next subphase: building, 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 and then recovery. And now we're moving into the fight-specific phase in this example, where you're going to start at a higher level, somewhere around week 5 with training difficulty, and we're going to shoot way up here. And this is why these are called shock training weeks, is because there's a rather large increase in training difficulty, which is going to be sustained for 2 weeks. And that's why the whole thing is referred to as a shock subphase as well. Now, the thing to bear in mind is when you hit yourself hard here and you work really hard, you need to make sure that you give yourself a lot of recovery. And this recovery will even extend to this first week of the next developmental subphase, which should be building and then building, followed by recovery. And then we make our way into the fight camp. So let's move over here. And the first 4 weeks of the fight camp is characterized by a shock subphase. So what you're going to see is 3 hard shock training weeks, and you're going to get hit really hard here, so you're going to need a lot of time to recover. So that's what this 20th week is for, recovery week, and that's again why we're starting a little bit lighter here and then building back up. And again, another reason why we start off a little bit lighter here is because this is really not a typical developmental subphase. You're not going to have that recovery week at the end of it. Now, you have to identify how well you can tolerate this. If you're feeling a huge amount of fatigue around here, then maybe you do need to reduce the training difficulty a little bit earlier here. And then before you know it, you're in your taper. And the whole point of the taper is to see a reduction in training difficulty. So you're going to see your training difficulty fall primarily due to reducing volume, and it continues to fall right before your fight. And then you have your fight, and then your training difficulty will slowly increase in a stepwise manner until you get to the beginning of your next fight plan. So there you go. That's how you schedule in your training difficulty over the course of your 6-month plan. Okay, so let's get back over to that PowerPoint and let's summarize everything that we've learned. So remember, first we learned about those 3 concepts, the training difficulty, load planning, and training subphases. And after that, we actually applied those concepts and we started to plan your training subphases and your training weeks and the training difficulty and all that. We're almost there. The next thing that we need to do, we're going to move on to step 4 in session 10, and we're going to actually move into programming those individual training sessions. So that's it for this lecture, and I look forward to seeing you in the next. Until then, take care.